I'm gonna resume. All right, we're recording. Again, I'm Ryan Stellar, CEO and co-founder of Standard Care, and with me today is Michael Martinelli. Mike is going to be presenting on the delineation between wellness products and FDA regulated medical devices, particularly in the software side of things. And I'm going to let him take it away. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Ryan. Again, my name is Mike Martinelli. I'm head of government at Standard Care, and like Ryan said, I have a background in health law, public policy, biomedical sciences. I worked at HHS Region 3 in Philly doing HIPAA enforcement many years ago. I also have done a lot of, I worked in academia a lot. I did some research at UPenn, health economics research. My background, basically everything I do, it's very tailored towards healthcare law, especially regulations. In the healthcare field, although you see, a lot of people are under the misperception that, everything in health law is medical malpractice, which is just a very very bit of it. When you're in a, you have your business, your firm, and you're working in some type of digital health solution, what you'll be dealing with are various types of healthcare regulations at the federal level. And my goal here, our goal here, is to help you to understand which that, first of all, which ones that they exist, which regulations exist, and which regulations you need to look out for and be aware of when you're developing and putting your digital health solution out to market. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and start the PowerPoint and share my screen. All right, can everyone see the full slideshow, not the presenter view?
Good to go, Mike.
Awesome. All right, so today's webinar, the topic is wellness versus FDA. So we're focusing on devices, whether or not they're regulated by the FDA, or they could be a wellness device that's not regulated by the FDA. And just for some background, the FDA, when it comes to regulating medical stuff, there's medical device regulations, and then there's pharmaceuticals regulations. Both are if you talk to regulatory affairs professional and they do FDA compliance work, they either do device or pharma because of how different they are. And I believe the RAC exam also, for those of you who are familiar with that, the regulatory affairs professional, like the certification exam, there's one exam for devices and one for pharma. So we'll be focusing on the FDA regulations as they pertain to medical devices, to compare that to looking at wellness in the context of digital health. So the regulatory agency here is the FDA, and that's an agency within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. So first, getting into a brief overview of medical device regulation. So I just want to put a little, note here, just to keep in mind during this webinar. When I'm going to have a few slides on medical device regulations, but it's in no way, a comprehensive, thorough explanation of medical device regulation. The purpose of this is to kind of give you a backdrop of what the type of regulatory scheme you'll be looking at if you have a product and you're trying to decide whether you're going the wellness route, or which is the non-FDA regulated route, or the FDA regulated route. And throughout this presentation, I'll have a series of slides with these large graphs and diagrams on there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing those diagrams, but I put them on there because it's my intention to, at some point after this webinar, to distribute these lecture slides to everyone who joined today, so you could refer to them whenever you would like. And I think there's some useful resources in here that you could use by yourselves, not listening to a lecture if you want to flip through, and look, especially some of these diagrams. And also, this a recording of this will be posted online within a few days as well. So back to the content here. What exactly is a medical device? So the FDA gets its regulatory authority over medical devices from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. So in this box here, I'm not going to read it. This is the big legal jargon, technical definition of a medical device. But really, what it comes down to is a medical device is a product that is intended for the use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, prevention, or treatment of a disease or condition. That's the key for when we're looking at a medical device. And there's 3 risk classifications for medical devices as well. So we have 3 classifications for medical devices. One part of that is risk. So we have class 1 devices have low risk, class 2 moderate, class 3 high. The first, I have 3 examples here. The first one on the left, this little wheel thing right here, is personally my most favorite invention of all time. It's called a chirp wheel. It's a yoga wheel for those of you, if you're out there, if you have back pain, chronic back pain, this thing works wonders. This is a class 1 device. So if you're using it correctly, you should not experience any serious injury or bodily harm or risk death. You just roll on your back, and then there's barely any risk of bodily harm. The second one here in the center, we see these a lot. You might know someone who has a continuous glucose monitor. There's tons of commercials for them. This is a class 2 in terms of risk. And the reason for that is because if you think about how it works, is you have that actual device itself that you could hold in your hand, that electronic component, and connected to that is a little IV wire that goes under the skin. Because there's that, it requires an incision, but a slight incision, that right there bumps it up to the moderate risk level, even though it's very, very unlikely to cause serious bodily injury or harm. But you have to, there's always a chance for infection if you don't keep it clean, or if there's a faulty IV wire on there, it might not read your blood glucose correctly. So there's potential for some injury if it's not maintained properly. The third one on the right, this is a pacemaker, or I might have put an implantable defibrillator, cardioverter. This is a class 3 device because this requires a surgical procedure, 1, to implant, and 2, this device is required, say, if we're looking at implantable cardioverters in and of themselves. If you have sudden death, like a sudden cardiac arrest, that cardioverter has to be functioning properly, meaning it's functioning properly as it's programmed to, and it has to have enough battery in order to give your heart that shock, the right amount of shock to bring it back into sinus rhythm. So there's a risk here of, if this isn't constantly monitored for the way it's working, functioning properly, if it's not constantly monitored for its battery life, that could very well result in serious injury or even death. So that's why this is an example of a high-risk class 3 device. So device classifications again. So these classifications aren't only based on risk. There's other components to these classifications as well, and I included 2 more columns here. Going from to the right from the risk column, We have the regulatory controls here. So each class has its own regulatory controls designation. And then this is what I'll be getting into in later slides, the pre-market submission type. So what regulatory controls means is it establishes the appropriate amount of oversight to ensure safety and efficacy. So if you have no idea what a regulatory control is, and if you just look at class 1 general, class 2 general and special, class 3 it has the most. Like the further you go down to, those regulatory controls are they're going to correspond to the risk level of that class. And to the right here, this is just an example of regulatory controls in this box right here. And learn your rules, as Dwight's saying right here. This is like the gateway, the threshold of if you have to go into the device regulation, go into that territory, this is the first gatekeeping aspect that you're going to have to look at, whether it's a device, what class it is, and then what type of market submission you're going to have to submit. And this is what I'll get into in the next few slides. This slide right here, I included as a diagram for you to refer to later. This is a nice, easy graphic of how to navigate the regulatory submissions process. Nice little overview. So here, I'm going to talk about the different types of regulatory submissions. First, there's the pre-market notification 510K. This is a very popular one. It's used in class 1 or class 2, most commonly a class 2 submission. And this requires, in order to have a 510K submission, your device that you're putting to market or trying to put to market and get FDA approved has to, with that application, you have to identify a predicate device. And what a predicate device is a device that already exists and is legally marketed, and is substantially equivalent to the new device that you're seeking to put to market. So if we use the blood glucose monitor example, if you have a blood glucose monitor, like you invented a new one that has, say, a mobile app component, and it could sync data to the mobile app and show you graphics, trends in your blood glucose levels. That would be, you could use any other blood glucose monitor on the market as your predicate device, because the key components of the blood glucose monitor that are make it a device that was initially approved was the actual electronic monitor itself, and that functioning, the functioning that allows it to, one, read your blood glucose and then display it, and then two, the wire, the IV wire that goes in. So the core components have already been approved. That's why you can do an FDA 510K submission, instead of doing a brand new submission and submitting all of your own new evidence to try to show that this device is safe. And that'll make more sense when we look at the next one here, which is the PMA, the pre-market approval application. And this is what you see with the class 3 devices, which are the ones of the higher risk. So this requires that the manufacturer demonstrates reasonable assurance regarding the device's safety and efficacy. So unlike 510K, where you could make that demonstration just by citing a predicate device, for a PMA, the manufacturer has to submit evidence that, standing alone by itself, not, aside from any predicate device, that evidence stands alone can show show with reasonable assurance that the device is safe and effective. So as opposed to 510K, they're able to show with reasonable assurance that the device is safe and effective simply by citing a predicate device, because that predicate device was already shown to be safe and effective. And the next is our de novo submission. So these are for new and novel devices. So say there's a new medical device that was invented and there's nothing like it of its kind has ever existed before. That would require a de novo submission, and you only see these with class 2 and 3. You'll never see this with the class 1 device. And you see here, I wrote, it creates a new classification regulation alternative to PMA, and that it has no existing classification. So you might kind of, make sound a little confusing, but wait, I already said that there's class 1, class 2, and class 3 based on their safety and efficacy, or based on their safety. But if you have a brand new device that there is no other device out there on the market that exists like it, we don't know yet whether its safety would be more like a class 2 or a class 3. So you have to give a demonstration of evidence showing its safety profile. And then once you show its safety profile based on evidence, this is usually, obtained through clinical trials data. The regulatory controls burden, like how much oversight it needs, will be dictated by that. And the safety profile of these de novo devices, or devices being submitted to be a de novo, are going to likely reflect, be very similar to those of like a class 2 or a class 3. But it's just, we don't say it already has a classification since it doesn't exist yet. And then we have an investigational device exemption. These are devices that kind of, piggybacking off of de novo. These are devices that are not on the market, but they're just being used in clinical trials to test their safety and efficacy. And that data that they obtain from the clinical trials, should they go well and you obtain good, solid data, that data would be used for a future marketing campaign. So you could have a device that's being tested. It has to go before an IRB when you do have clinical trials, institutional review board, to make sure that it, is ethical. You have a good study protocol. And then this is the type of thing, it's brand new. You would probably see if it's you obtained solid data, that would be submitted as a de novo later on down the line. And then there's the humanitarian device exemption. This is so for this submission, you only have to show with reasonable assurance safety and benefit. You don't have to show effectiveness. And the reason for that is because safety is most important. If we had to choose safety and effectiveness, effectiveness, that if you think about the type of data that requires, you would need some more longitudinal data. And in a humanitarian situation, say you're going to a lesser developed country that's having a serious public health emergency, and we have this brand new device that we know is safe, we could get that exception, even though we didn't have enough time to get data to prove its effectiveness. And the reason for that is because the time is of the essence when you have a humanitarian device. As long as it's safe, it might not be effective, but at least you're not going to, have a risk of harm by letting it be used in that context. So here, this is another one of those tables I just included for your later reference, because there's often a lot of, not really confusions, but it's very complex and a little bit difficult when comparing PMAs versus 510K submissions. So your PMA, your class 3 versus your 510K class 2 submissions. And this graph nicely shows the differences between the two. So submission timeframes. There's a lot of stuff here. You could, if you were really getting into this, your mind would probably be like, oh, there's so much to absorb. But I'm trying to like be as very, very like, just, on the top, not really get in depth at all, because that's not the purpose of this webinar. So this graph on the right is a timeline that you can see. It's another comparison between 510K and PMAs, but specifically for their timelines, submission timelines. One interesting note about 510K submissions. So if you see on this graph on the left, that 90-day timeline right there, if the FDA doesn't issue that MD, the MDUFA by that 90-day timeline, technically that 510K device that you submitted, you could go, it's cleared to go to market by default. So that's just a little note right there. Now I have two additional special types of regulatory submissions. First is the breakthrough device program. I believe this came about during COVID. It replaces expedited access pathway and priority review for devices. I didn't get into that, and it's not necessary for the purpose of this webinar. But basically, expedited access pathway and priority review are already types of submission processes that are in place that are already kind of accelerated, and this replaces that. The regulatory submission type would be a designation for breakthrough device Q submission. And it has to satisfy certain eligibility requirements, that device, in order to obtain a breakthrough device program submission. First, the device has to be able to, you have to show that that device could be subject to either PMA, 510K, or de novo submission requirements. That's number one. And number two, it has to satisfy both criteria from this graph right here. So this graph, or for this table, has two criteria. The first criteria and then the second criteria. Those must also be met in order to submit a breakthrough device via Q submission. And you could refer back to this graph again once we distribute them. And then the second special submissions program is a software pre-cert program, which is kind of in limbo right now. We're still waiting on seeing if the FDA is going to start making some progress on this, but it's a pretty solid, the way it was originally designed, a pretty good program with a good purpose. And basically it allows software as a medical device, that's SAMD. I'll get into that in later slides. Manufacturers of those, they could demonstrate their embedded CQOE and ultimately participate in a streamlined, which is an efficient and predictable. And when I say predictable, meaning that you know which steps, you know the exact pathway you're going to have to go in terms of the FDA regulatory process. And examples of the culture, quality, organizational excellence standards are in this little box below on the right. And here on the left-hand side, you could refer back to this if you want. This is the purpose and goal of this pre-cert program. And then this is the public and health innovation outcomes. This is what I think consider to be like the justification for it. And if this were to go into full practice, in theory, I think it could be very beneficial. But we're not going to be really seeing any of this at the time being, because it's like, again, kind of in limbo right now, and not moving forward at the moment with the FDA. Now, software functions. So this is where we're going to get into the crux of the webinar. Software function as a regulated medical device. So when you have software functions, like in that previous slide, you saw that SAMD, you could have that as a medical device. And this is important when we talk about software functions, because this is where we're getting into differentiating between medical devices and wellness products, because it comes down to comparing medical devices as software versus the wellness products that aren't considered devices. And we'll get more into that. So the general definition of software as a medical device is standalone software that has a medical function and works as a medical device in and of itself. Example of that is the category of AI and machine learning. And then software functions, this is just a general definition of software functions that are considered a medical device. So when I talk about software function, it means you could have a software program that has several different functions. If you take each of those functions and look at them individually, we can make an assessment as to whether those individual functions alone in and of themselves function as a medical device or not. So 3 instances when the functions are generally considered medical devices. They could transform a mobile platform into a regulated medical device. So you see this a lot in phone apps, iPhone apps, which they refer to as medical mobile apps in the FDA. If you have, say, an iPad that syncs up to you're in the OR, and the angiogram can now sync up to an iPad in the cath lab, that mobile platform is being transformed into a medical device. If through that iPad you can, this is hypothetical, this does not exist, but say through that iPad you could actually press a button. It has a software function where you could deliver some more dye into the arteries to see an angiogram. So if that iPad, which in and of itself isn't a software, it doesn't have software that acts as a medical device, if you connect it to the angiogram and you download the software that enables it and transforms it into a medical device, that's an example of this first category. Second, if the software function connects to an existing device for the purposes of controlling its operation, function, or energy source. So say we could use the same example, that iPad, in terms of function, if we had say you had an iPhone, even though this would never happen in a cath lab, you can connect it to the digital output on the cath lab table that controls the dye injection. If that iPhone has a software with a function, if you put a software that has the function on there where you could push it, like push a button and say a certain level of dye, and then that dye would actually it would inject the amount of dye into the patient's arteries, that you're using that software function to that iPhone is now becoming a medical device in and of by the fact that it's controlling another medical device that's an existing medical device, which is obviously the dye injecting apparatus. And then also, there are caveats to these that we'll get into, but generally, if it's used in active patient monitoring or to analyze patient-specific medical device data. Active patient monitoring, you have your you have a new generation pacemaker, and it's has a new software program in it that can allow physicians to monitor you in real time and actually look at, historical trends of arrhythmias, allow them to adjust the settings in terms of what kind of shock output you need for a certain arrhythmia. So that's an example of this third bucket. So now there's the IMDRF is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, and the purpose of the IMDRF is to come up with a uniform, and this is a collaborative approach from with many countries involved, mostly European, to come up with a uniform, harmonious way to categorize different types of risk categories. And here, I just wanted to include this slide to show you that how as the risk stratification of as software as a medical device, it could be categorized and classified using the IMDRF criteria. And that's all the only point I wanted to make with this slide. And then here, this is just for future reference. There's two arrows on this left-hand box, the first one going up and down, increasing criticality. The top box right here explains what that means. And then likewise, a horizontal arrow, increasing significance. The bottom box explains what that means and what the criteria are. So what about software functions that are designed to assist or aid in the clinical decision process making? So those would be clinical decision support software, CDS. So many of you may be familiar with this. The general definition right here, very, very general, is the software basically is intended to, what I just said, aid in the important thing here, it's to aid in the decision support for practitioners when making diagnoses, cure, mitigation, prevention, treatment of a disease or condition. This last part right here, this is directly from the definition of a medical device. So it's being used for that purpose. So this is where we're getting some gray area. The regulatory status and enforcement jurisdiction is still evolving. There's been the 21st Century Cures Act has added some amendments to clarify, CDS in terms of when it's considered software as a medical device in general, not as specific as we like, but those new amendments help us to differentiate SAMD or software functions as medical devices, contrast that from that of wellness products. And this box right here at the bottom, this is just an example of how gives you the criteria that is used to determine whether a device is the criteria for device CDS and then non-device CDS. Non-device CDS means that it's a clinical decision support software that is a non-regulated medical device. So that's where we would potentially be getting into wellness product territory. So this table right here would be a very useful reference. Now we have our medical device data systems. This comes up a lot. So generally what this is hardware, software products intended for the transfer, store, conversion, of formats and display of medical device data. It does may or may not be intended for patient monitoring. And importantly, it does not modify the data or modify the display of the data. And it does not by itself control the functions and parameters of the medical device. So a little bit more about this. For the software, so the guidance says for software for MDDS, there are software functions that may or may not be intended for patient monitoring. The important thing here is that the software functions the software functions are not intended for interpretation or analysis of clinical lab findings for the diagnosis, treatment, cure, prevention, mitigation of disease. So that's kind of an important takeaway for that. Now, medical device versus wellness. Now we're going to compare what we kind of talked about with software functions to actual wellness, like where the line is and how you could kind of get into, how we navigate whether or not this is a device or a regulated or non-regulated wellness product. So just as a brief overview, 21st Century Cures Act did give some, with this amendments, give some guidance and some additional provisions that help clarify wellness versus devices. And categories B, D, and C here we cover in this lecture. And if anyone was participating in our previous webinar, we talked about Class C. So what exactly is a wellness product? So the important thing about a wellness product is that it's a health-related technology, but it's low risk. And its attributes and components do not fall under FDA medical device regulation. And that means that it is not intended for, again, these are our buzzwords right here: diagnosis, cure, mitigation, prevention, and treatment of a disease or condition. So the FDA device enforcement policy, their guidance, they show us two different categories of general wellness uses. So the first category is relating to software, is relating to or maintaining or encouraging a general state of health or health activity. You think about a Fitbit, that could be an example of encouraging healthy lifestyle. And for the first category, we have software and hardware. So in terms of wellness, the software functions that are excluded from the device definition, when I say device definition, that means regulated medical device, are the software functions that, like we set up here, do not perform any of the diagnosis treatment functions. In terms of hardware, here, general wellness intended uses for hardware, they satisfy they do satisfy the definition of medical devices. However, this is where enforcement discretion comes into play for hardware. The FDA does not intend to enforce compliance with the regulatory controls of these devices, of hardware devices that are general wellness devices with the intended use, as their intended use. These devices do fall under the definition of medical device, but the FDA, important here, enforcement discretion. They will not enforce compliance with wellness products that are hardware under the hardware subcategory. And then the second category of general wellness uses is when it relates to the role of a healthy lifestyle with helping others reduce the risk or impact of certain chronic diseases or conditions. So this is where it could be helping you maintain not just maintain a healthy lifestyle, or say you have a condition that's currently being treated. It might seem like it's helping treat the condition or help mitigate the condition, but if it's helping to reduce the risk of the impact of that condition, this would be the second category of a general wellness use. But the important thing to note here is that it's well understood and accepted that healthy lifestyle choices may play an important role in health outcomes of the disease or condition. So even without that wellness app or wellness technology, you could be doing whatever that technology was programmed to help you to do on your own, because that practice that it's encouraging is generally accepted and well understood to help mitigate that disease, chronic condition. So here's some examples of chronic or general wellness products, and I have them in three general categories. So there's hardware, software, and then what I call service. Hardware here, a great example of that is Fitbit, because the primary modality is its hardware function. Software here, I don't know if any of you have heard, maybe they used to have a lot of commercial for these. Noom, it is an app that's designed, it's a wellness app that's designed to help lose weight for weight management. And the primary modality is software. It's an app. It's a software program on your phone. And the last is in the bucket of service. And the example I have here is Well Theory. So these are wellness products or wellness items that the primary modality, even though it could be done through an app, is that you have interpersonal relationship with some, like a coach, a dietitian. So say it's a fitness app and it's something that you were assigned a one-on-one coach that you communicate directly with, a real human. That would be this other category, because the primary modality of this wellness service is your ability to communicate and work with another individual through the app or through the service. So this diagram right here, this is how I would show you like the borderline between wellness products. So thinking about software as a function, when is it a non-regulated FDA product, and when is it a regulated medical device? So on the right here in the red, this first we have those clinical decision support software, where their primary this clinical decision support software, this type is primarily relied upon by physicians to diagnose, cure, treat diseases. So if the software function is designed for this purpose, it's going to fall into this red category. Also, if the software function is used for interpreting or analyzing clinical lab tests or data, even when it's also intended for transferring, storing, converting, or displaying clinical lab results, which would be our MDDS right there, because it's being used to interpret, like when you're interpreting lab results, that's a component of treatment and diagnosing. So that would fall under the medical device category. So software functions as a wellness product. When you get over into the green side on the right, you still see similar words to its definition. It maintains or encourages a healthy lifestyle. The important thing here is that it does so, but that function is not related to the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of a disease or condition. Also, another thing for wellness products is when it uses information related to diagnostic or screening test result data. But the key here is that it's solely intended for transferring, storing, converting, or displaying clinical lab results data. So it's not, if it uses diagnostic or screening test data in and of itself, and there's no process in there where you have a practitioner interpreting or analyzing the data to come up with a diagnosis or some part of the treatment of the patient. And it's only intended to transfer, store, convert, or display somewhere else. That would fall, this is getting more into the wellness product side, because it's not, if you think about it, the golden rule here, when it comes down to it, if they're the primary, or if there's a significant component of the device that involves the treatment, cure, mitigation, prevention of disease or condition, that always keep that in mind. If that's the predominant aspect of your device or your technology, then you're going to have to really look at going over to the medical device side. And FDA has enforcement discretion here again. So what we often see is that firms, we're seeing them develop wellness software technology that slightly crosses over the line into the software function as a medical device. So they're making a technology over here, but they're creeping over here. And this is a common strategy that's used not only in the healthcare realm. This could be used in regulations for EPA, environmental regulations, labor regulations. They creep over this side as much as they can, basically testing the limits to gauge how far they can go until the FDA puts their foot down and then exerts their enforcement discretion and says, hey, you're at the point here where we're going to regulate you as a medical device. So that's
Hey, Mike,
strategy. Oh,
Mike,
yeah.
we're running out of time. We had some questions. Could you
Sure. Yeah,
maybe
we're
wrap
done.
up? Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Hey, Ethan.
Yes.
Thank you for the question. I think you emailed beforehand also.
Yep.
So thanks for doing that. Let's make it a little bit more interactive. And Ethan, why don't you just introduce yourself quickly and let us know what you're working on.
I'm working on a wearable device to monitor heart failure patients in the form factor of compression and also Apple Watch. So I guess I've like the Nixon group, they've stated to me that likely it'll be a SAMD. However, you did bring up the device CDS, but not regulated. So I think they were alluding to that as well. Like if you were to do a app on the watch, for example, you can potentially avoid, like you're still under jurisdiction, but you can avoid 510K as an app. I'm not sure if that's true, and that's what you're talking about earlier. Can you sort of maybe delineate how that would be possible? And I've seen other sort of the second part to that is I asked in this, like there are digital therapeutics that are being approved. I'm not sure what the difference is between that and software as medical. Is that a subset or go ahead.
Yeah. So digital therapeutics is a broad category, and it's kind of like it's a very general concept that was started. Sean Duffy from Omada, I think, kind of coined it maybe almost 10 years ago now, and it's a subset. Things have split. So what we've seen is we've seen consumer applications from gaming or advertising or whatever kind of move up in terms of clinical impact and refer to them as digital therapeutics in order to gain a certain amount of credibility and like maybe raise the price point. And then the people who started as intending to be FDA regulated wanted more delineation from those more casual products. And the prescription digital therapeutics barrier was introduced in like 2019. Companies started talking about it. Pair therapeutics was kind of the main one. So the category is not it's not defined. The digital therapeutics as a term is not defined by the FDA. The FDA is concerned with software as medical device, and then certain digital therapeutics will cross over into software as medical device. And then due to the extra cost and intended use implications of the product, it may become prescription on label. And then typically those companies will use the PDTX label on their products to signal higher value. And then with clinical decision support, it's being argued right now. So the lobby group around the professional lobbying group around clinical decision support doesn't want it to be labeled by the FDA because it's kind of slows things down. And then the FDA is actually arguing in favor of jurisdiction, which is an interesting move from my perspective historically, because clinical decision support has the doctor or the provider as the final person, but I think the case that they're making is that if you think of like ChatGPT or something, the influence of the AI is getting so strong, it's beginning to bypass and sort of nullify the doctor's judgment, and in that case becomes software as medical device.
So just to reiterate, so mine would have a MD at the end of the decision-making process. So it sounds like it's a device that would be under jurisdiction of the FDA, and you don't see any way around getting a 510K, another 510K on an app on an Apple Watch.
I would need to see. That's a pretty specific case. I would.
Okay.
From my professional credibility perspective, I would want to see more specifics on that. So the things that are relevant, if you've done a risk assessment, so there's something called ISO 14971. And there's a couple of different frameworks for risk evaluation, both kind of like bottoms up and top down within 14971. I'd encourage you to pull references to those and then, run like a draft, and then you'll be able to determine more correctly. And in fact, if you can use this as part of your integrated go-to-market strategy, right? So if you want to choose to have low regulatory burden, you can identify your risks and then design them out, which is definitely a reasonable way to go. But with anything to do with heart failure, I don't know. I'd be happy to chat about it one-on-one. That's an interesting use case.
Heart failure is a good route to go. Because hospitals and practices want to reduce those 30-day admissions, readmissions.
Yeah, huge cost driver. All right, Ethan. Anything else we can answer while you're on?
I was just wondering also to that question about RPMs, whether they differ, because it sounds like it will be either SAMD versus device that's either regulated or not regulated by the FDA, but it's a CDS, something of a CDS. Either way, does that affect your RPM billing in either category? Either way, it's going to be a device. As long as it's marketable.
The concept of a device. So I want to say devices can just be software. So it's really the differentiation is there a hardware component or is it software only? I think, and then from the way you're phrasing it, and the RPM, generally, so RPM is remote physiologic monitoring. It's a set of like 6 or 8 codes, CPT codes that are issued by AMA, and then reimbursement and coverage varies quite a bit. Medicare, actually just yesterday had a medical advisory committee board meeting on that was almost unanimously supportive of continuing funding and coverage for RPM and remote therapeutic monitoring.
Mhm.
And generally, because they're used in medical practice, the any software or device attached to them is going to have to be regulated.
Mm.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's these codes, because they can be billed monthly, are a glide path towards holistic value-based care, and I think it's there's a lot of ways they can potentially be applied, but generally you're going to need like on-label, because there's going to need to be medical necessity to bill for them, and then you're going to have to show that the therapy is obviously safe and then efficacious in a validated manner. And by the time you do all that, you're principally you're probably building a medical device.
Right, but I think yeah, so I am building a medical device which would be more traditional 510K, etc. So it follows device path, but the Apple Watch app would be more on the earlier phase. So it would be kind of like a beta version of what we build. So that's where I think maybe I can dial down or mitigate some of the risks by not going through some of these processes.
Yeah,
I don't know if I could do that.
I would say, well, these processes do mitigate risk. So you're more likely to mitigate risk by going through the processes. I would say you would lower your operating expenditures by trying to avoid these.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the uh there's something called, basically the FDA wants to know if the software is practicing medicine. So if the FDA watch is interpreting data and results in a way that the FDA thinks it's practicing medicine, then it will be regulated. And the way you can mitigate that is by doing what's called a Q-sub, or a pre-submission meeting,
Yeah.
which is a non-binding meeting that a regulatory affairs advisor can guide you to get a clear answer on that for your specific case.
Right. I was told that we need to have a clear game plan for this. So you lead the conversation rather than, ask questions like I am today. So you have to be like, this is what I want to do, like I said, and this is a path we think we go forward. I'm not sure,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah, it's extremely case dependent. If you haven't talked to a regulatory affairs specialist, do you have any predicates you've identified? Do you know what product code you would be?
Yeah. Oh, not for the device, not for the Apple Watch. I thought, you'd be able to, if you don't make any interpretations on the signals, because signals makes it a device, right? So if you have the signals and you don't make any conclusions, you're kind of triaging and highlighting and doing that kind of things without interpretation, then the other law group was saying, you have to walk like on the other side of the line, and then you may be able to avoid those reviews for the Apple Watch. But eventually you roll out an Apple Watch thing that's more sophisticated and 510K or whatever. But that's at a later time. You can do it kind of in different phases.
I would agree presenting signals probably won't be, but when you get into triaging, to the extent like what algorithm is doing the triaging is salient. So if the triaging is potentially hiding information from a care provider, that could lead to a negative outcome, that it might cross the line.
Okay. That's very specific.
Ryan, we do have another question in the chat.
Yeah. With regards to solutions being built on GPT for symptom checking, engagement, etc., how do you see the regulatory framework governing this? I think there's two things. The government has limited resources and they have enforcement discretion, as Mike alluded to. So what they regulate is sometimes random based on when they send somebody to your office to start regulating you. And then they may then still choose not to regulate you. So what we'll see with ChatGPT is there'll be far more instances of it in the wild than the FDA can catch up with or cares to catch up with. However, I affirmatively believe that over time it will be regulated, and what we'll need to see is Francois Cholet talks about this, but there's a technique called ablation studies where you ablate or remove different nodes of the subnetwork of the large language model to validate positive predictive value of the model, providing a correct response to, a defined set of inputs. That type of technique will be necessary, I think, for validation. In medical device, so this is under the regulation CFR 820. There's various subparts, .10, .20, .30, and one of them is design controls. And design controls has something called V&V, or verification and validation. Verification is testing you do internally. Validation is things you do outside of the building, either as human factors or clinical trials. So I believe the validation aspect of ChatGPT will be necessary eventually, but we'll see a lot of real world anecdotal examples where it's not regulated happening all over the place. And in fact, standard care consumer interface actually has a large language model chat interface in it currently that is limited to just providing care navigation guidance based on providers in our network.
Yeah, I mean, just going a little bit, going on a little bit more with that, like in terms of symptom checking engagement, I believe we're going to have a webinar in this at some point talking about medical coding and licensing. So like, say it goes as far as to, it asks you for your symptoms, and then like it gives a diagnosis based on what you say your symptoms are, or whether you input symptoms that were given like right off your medical record. At least here in the US, we're going to talk about like that gray area, whether that is the unauthorized practice of medicine, because ChatGPT doesn't have, software program, it can't get a medical license to practice. So looking at those lines and seeing what it's doing, that's a topic, going to be a hot topic.
Yeah, I suspect this is already in the roadmap for OpenAI and Microsoft. I think they're almost definitely doing this. It's just too massive a use case. So I think they'll probably have an FDA approved model at some point that will be comically defeatured from the one consumers use today, but will pass V&V. And I bet we see that by 2025. All right. Thank you, everybody, for being.
Criterion?
Oh,
sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
What is this criterion of basis? Because I think